Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. In this video, we're going to be talking about cult recovery. Many of you will remember that we had this conversation on this subject with Dr. Alexandra Stein, who very graciously appeared on the channel and went over this topic in great detail. I've decided, because this is such an important topic, to get a new perspective. It's with great pleasure that I welcome to the channel one of Dr. Stein's colleagues, Dr. Janja Lalich. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Lloyd. I mean, I'm sorry it's taken so long for us to finally get connected, but I'm happy to be here.
We've been on each other's radar, but it's one of those things where it just doesn't work out for whatever reason, but you're here now, and that's the important thing. And you bring to the table over 30 years of studying controversial groups and abusive relationships. You're Professor Emerita of Sociology at California State University. You're a wonderful person to speak to on this topic, and I'm really looking forward to expanding the conversation that we had with your colleague, Dr. Stein.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
So with Dr. Stein, we had a series of questions. It was actually 3 questions, and I've added a 4th on the end for this conversation. And it may be that there are supplementary questions that get asked along the way. But what we'll do to make this an easier viewing experience for the viewers is we'll make this available in chapters so that you can, in fact, skip to the question that's of most interest to you using the timestamps in the description below. The first question, how do people get involved in cults?
Well, people get involved in cults in a variety of ways, and certainly a variety of ages. Young people these days are often recruited on college campuses, where I would say primarily by religious cults or sometimes political cults. But today, really, I think the prevalence of people joining cults are people more 30 and over, because I think cults have learned over time that recruiting young people can be a little bit of a problem because they're harder to handle. And also they prefer people who already have skills, who are already educated, who may have important networks that can lend legitimacy to the group. When they're older, it's more likely that their parents aren't going to try to get them out. They're like, well, he's 35, he can do what he wants to do. So people get in, it's definitely changed somewhat over time, especially because of the internet. A lot of people, I'd say some people find something on the internet of interest to them and they listen to YouTube videos or follow some particular guru, and then perhaps they sign up. And of course, today we have the special problem of the QAnon movement and the anti-vaxxers and all of that, which is way more visible online than physical, what I now call the run-of-the-mill cults, right? The brick and mortar cults where we always knew who was the leader and where did they live and where were their centers. And so
do you feel as though these movements are borrowing from the playbook of more traditional cults?
Absolutely. Right. They're very cult-like in their behavior and their mindset, which is closed, the things we've recognized. So I think people get involved when they're perhaps looking for something to join that will give them some purpose in life or some meaning. There's this idea that it's just seekers and there's something wrong with being a seeker. But in my opinion, everybody's a seeker in a sense, because we're all human beings. We're all social animals. We all want some type of community or family. Most people want purpose in life or feel like they're part of something. And so that's the way that people often get, involved in something that they don't know what the bottom line is when they're joining. And that's one of the problems with cults, that there's not that kind of transparency. And so people, get recruited, get invited to something. More than 60% of people in cults get recruited by a friend, a family, or a coworker. So obviously, if someone's inviting you to something, it's of somebody it's far more difficult to say no to somebody And all you need to do is go to that first thing, and then the people there are going to glom onto you, right? Whether it's a spiritual thing or political or new age or self-help, whatever. And in most cases, they'll do what we call love bombing, where they'll make you feel like you're oh so special, and they'll invite you back. And of course, that's if you then, because they've been so kind to you, often feel obligated. Okay, I'll come back. And there it goes from there. I mean, cult recruiters are really good at what you do. But I think what's an important factor is that the message of the cult has to resonate with you. So people who've heard me before are probably tired of hearing me say this, but I always say I never would have joined a meditation cult because I can't sit still that long. But a political cult, when I heard about that, I mean, I didn't know it was a cult, but oh yeah, sure, change the world, make the world a better place. So the message has to resonate with you or you're not going to respond. And that's what I think recruiters are very good at, spotting that particular vulnerability and focusing on those people as their primary targets.
If I were to do a poll of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who watch the channel, and that's by no means everyone, there's a large percentage that have never been Jehovah's Witnesses, but if I were to poll the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who watch this channel, probably a percentage would say that they were recruited, but if I had to guess, the majority would say that like me, they were born into the religion, which, if you think about it, is a way of bypassing a lot of this trickery altogether.
Yes.
Because when you're raising a child, you get to tell the child what the reality that it's been born into is,
Yes. And that's certainly one of the major issues today, and one of the focuses of my work, because the last book I wrote was about children born or raised in a cult. I think it's a really important issue because so many of these kids, who are usually young adults or adults when they leave, get out in the world and they don't really know how the world operates, because the world has been interpreted for them by the ideology of the group. So it's often very, very difficult for people when they leave. And as you know, among the ex-witnesses, as well as other groups, there's an enormous number of suicides, which is just absolutely tragic, because people can't find the resources. As a society, we don't have the resources available for people. And so, yeah, being born in is a very special phenomenon that the recovery has for people is quite different in terms of the issues faced, because they don't have that past to go back to.
Yeah, there's no frame of reference, is there, as to what normal is. Normal is the cult,
Exactly.
So let's thank you for addressing that. That's fascinating. So the next question that we tackled in part one, I should say, is how do cults affect people?
Oh, well, that's a pretty big question. Well, I'd say, first of all, people are going to have different experiences, even in the same cult. And that's why you can find someone who might say, oh, well, it wasn't so bad. And then you have someone else who was completely traumatized. So the people are affected by, usually, I would say, having lived in an alternate universe, so to speak, so that their view of the world is, of course, shaped by the view of the cult leader or the cult's ideology. And so whether someone's born in or even joins later on, their entire framework for the world changes. And within that, their sense of self changes. And it's primarily, it's primarily your sense of self that the cult attacks, because they want to take you apart and create a new you who's going to comply and conform. So the indoctrination program, which, people often don't even recognize what's going on, through the courses, through the lessons, through the examples set by older members, all of the ways in which people are shaped while they're in the organization really messes with their mind. And so I'd say one of the biggest effects is that in many cases, if people came in as adults, their own sense of morality gets usurped by the morality or the immorality of the cult leader. So that people tend to do things that they never would have done otherwise, except that they're in this particular situational environment. And of course, there have been many studies, including the famous prison experiment by Dr. Zimbardo, that shows what this kind of situational influence. And it's not the fault of the person. It's because the environment is, in a sense, coercing you or forcing you to behave and think in a certain way. And then that, as people more and more incorporate the beliefs of the cult and the behaviors of the cult, they get to a point that I call bounded choice. And at that state of mind, they actually believe that they could not survive outside of the cult. And so even if they have thoughts of leaving, they immediately banish them, because outside of the cult is, in a sense, death, literal or sometimes actual. The cult will, feed you these ideas that how dangerous it is in the outside world. So people get trapped, in a sense, psychologically trapped. And I know that happened in my case, where for about 5 years, I wanted to leave my group, and I absolutely just couldn't figure out how to go out the door. So it's that sense of self that I think is primarily affected in everyone, and then to different degrees, depending on the group that it is, depending on their level of membership in the group, how old they were when they joined, or obviously if they were born in, there's not much choice there at all, to who they want to be or what they want to believe. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but
no, that was very helpful. I love that phrase, bounded choice. It feels like there's almost like a survival element here, similar to, the dynamics when ostracism is practiced, ostracism being a very visceral pain that people feel. Obviously, people feel pain. There's a reason for pain, and it's to motivate people to make a change. Right. And, we feel that pain when we're ostracized because, back on the savannah, if your tribe deserts you, you're dead. Exactly. And it feels as though there's a similar dynamic going on there with bounded choice, where you are manipulated into thinking that, you will die if you were to stray outside the confines of this bubble of safety that's
exactly
you've been. Yeah.
And it's also, I think what's the most, devious part of it is that it creates this illusion of choice. Even, for example, if you watch the videos of the members of Heaven's Gate before they committed suicide, they made these videos and said, "Oh, I'm doing this of my own free will. I'm doing this of my own free will." Well, this whole idea of free will is such a bugaboo because, first of all, who knows what free will is? But secondly, presumably you always have free will unless someone's holding a gun to your head. Well, in the case of most cults, no one's holding a gun to your head, but they're holding these psychological threats to your head. And so you make choices based on this pressure of knowing that you need to stay within the good graces of the group or your life is over, in some way or another. And so people think they're doing all these things willingly when in fact they're very cleverly being coerced.
And just to pick up on what you were saying there, if you don't mind, I'd like to bring in, like, as a very recent example in terms of Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm trying to find the exact words here, but I'm probably not going to find them in time. But at the latest annual meeting event for Jehovah's Witnesses, they talk about the Jews returning from Babylon and how they had a choice as to whether they stayed in Babylon or whether they returned to the promised land to reestablish true worship and what have you. And David Splain makes a comment. I can't find it off the top of my head, but he makes a comment. Of course, they had a choice. Today, people don't have a choice, because if they stay in Babylon the Great meaning false religion or any other religion other than Jehovah's Witnesses, they're going to die. Their lives are at stake. So it's interesting how the language changes when you're inside. When you're inside, they speak with a bit more freeness. But when you're being recruited, it's, oh, well, you know, this is just all about choice.
Right. Nobody's going to tell you what to do. You can leave whenever you want, you know.
Yeah.
And people often say, well, you know, you can leave such and such a group, you know, so it can't be a cult. Well, it's not about that. You know, it's about the dynamics and the behaviors that go on within the cult. You know, sure, people can leave. I mean, in my group, we got rid of people if they didn't cut the mustard. So that didn't make us not a cult, you know. So it's all very, very underhanded in a way. And takes advantage of people's idealism, you know.
Digging down a bit more on that question, though, of how do cults affect people, and that was a very helpful insight that you've given. I'm just thinking, you know, let's say someone's watching this who is married to, let's say, a former Jehovah's Witness, and whether that former Jehovah's Witness has woken up to the fact that they were in a cult, or whether they still carry the indoctrination. Perhaps they were disfellowshipped and they still think it's God's one true organization and they're going to die at Armageddon one day. You know, the way I think of it is, it's almost as though their brain chemistry has been altered, you know, that they've been, that they're coded with a set of behaviors that even when you disengage, you know, consciously from the, you know, from that reality, and you realize that you were deceived, you know, a lot of these behaviors stay with you. Does that
absolutely
make sense? No, yeah.
I think, and that's the importance today of the neurobiological studies. And you can just take an example of triggers. You know, when we leave cults, often something will happen, or we'll hear a voice, or we'll hear a song, and we get triggered, and we could start to dissociate or float, or, you know, suddenly freak out. So obviously these things are still present in the mind, in the brain. And, you know, I have this I think will be really interesting to you and your audience. I have a colleague, friend who is now a neuroscientist at Harvard. And he was actually a plaintiff in a lawsuit that I was expert witness in on gay conversion therapy. And he had been raised a Mormon. And when he was young, his parents sent him off to this place. Anyway, he's now a thriving neuroscientist at Harvard. And he is doing a study, and I don't quite understand the technology of it, but he's doing a study of brain chemistry and the responses, brain circuitry, and the responses to certain things in relation to fundamentalism. So they matched somehow this brain circuitry of fundamentalism with various categories of things. And the top 3 matches were criminality, violence, and confabulation. So I just found that so interesting. And we're actually hoping to write an article about this that I'll be joining in with him and his other colleague. But
when you say the top 3 matches, does that mean that there was a propensity for those things?
Yes, with someone who has a fundamentalist mindset. There's a propensity to criminality, violence, and confabulation, which means, you know, making things up, you know, living in another world. So I just found that extremely interesting when you look at the various religious fundamentalist groups, which certainly Jehovah's Witnesses is, but also many of the other cults that have an extreme belief system, which is in a sense fundamentalist. So,
yeah, that the confabulation is fascinating because, you know, again, I cover a lot of propaganda that comes out of Jehovah's Witnesses, and the amount of lying that goes on and just inventing this alternate reality that doesn't exist, you know, the rewriting of history even, including recent history that we can all remember, including the outbreak of the pandemic.
Right.
It's just astonishing, and you get this kind of denialism sometimes when you're trying to reason with people who are in cults. And they will quite often say, well, why would they lie to me? What do they have to gain?
Right.
But that seems to be part and parcel of the fundamentalist mindset, this propensity to lie.
Yeah. And then defending it. And, and I think one of the really, talk about confabulation and extremism. I think that the films and the graphics that Jehovah's Witnesses use, especially with young children, those horrifying videos of, people falling into pits of fire and all of that. I mean, you must know, imagine being a child and seeing those things, living with that kind of fear and stress and anxiety. I mean, when you ask what happens to people in cults, you think you found something and you think you're happy, but it's an incredibly stressful life because of the pressures. So, and that's why I think when people leave, there's so much evidence of anxiety attacks and panic attacks and unfounded fears and just, quaking in your boots when you're finally out of the group, but you're trying to figure out how to survive. And you have all this stuff still in your brain.
Well, I've admitted on this channel, bear in mind, I've been doing this for 10 years this year. And thank you. And about a year ago,
and you're still sane.
I'm still somehow, coherent and vertical, but we had a series of earthquakes, as you may know, in Croatia around December of last year.
Yeah,
and there'd been an aftershock. There'd been an earthquake in Zagreb prior to that, and this was during the pandemic. And I've admitted on this channel that, early morning, you're still kind of not quite aware, you're still coming round, and you're still kind of booting up almost, and your house starts shaking, and you're aware of the fact that there's a pandemic going on. And I admit that for a few split seconds, my brain was going Armageddon bingo. Okay, pandemics, check. Earthquakes, check. And I immediately shut it. My conscious brain immediately shut it down. But it was, and it may have been only a few split seconds, but it was there. And I'm conscious of it,
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, I've been out of my group for 35 years, and I still have those moments. I still have dreams and nightmares, actually. I mean, they don't dominate my life, but that stuff stays with you. And that's why I think going through a proper recovery is really important. So, you have the skills to dismiss those thoughts when they come forward.
Well, I'm glad that you've said that, because that leads us very neatly to the next question. And it's probably a nice point at which to remind viewers of the excellent book that you've co-written, Take Back Your Life, which I've referred to numerous times on this channel, in fact, read from repeatedly. Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships. And the question I'd like to tackle now is, how do people recover from a cult experience?
Well, again, that's going to vary, but I think the most important thing is to do what we call psychoeducation, which means educating yourself about what happened to you. Because until you can understand the enormity of the closed system that you were part of, it's going to be very difficult to really have, a full life, because there will be so many remnants and there will be this damaged sense of self. There's so much criticism and putting people down and humiliation and all of that, the constant confessions, etc., that people experience when they're in a cult. So when they get out, as I was saying before, your sense of self is damaged, and people come out with such an enormous amount, especially of shame and guilt, because of either things they participated in or things they witnessed and couldn't say anything or do anything. So that all has to be kind of taken apart. And and this is where I think my bounded choice framework helps, because what I often explain to people is and I'm somebody who's into writing and putting things on paper, but if they take my 4 points of bounded choice, or they can take Robert Lifton's 8 aspects of a thought reform program and put it on paper, and under each one write down, how did this work in my cult? How did my cult do this? How was my cult doing loaded language? What were the systems of control in my cult? And then you see the enormity of that closed system, that self-sealing system that you were part of. I truly believe that it helps relieve the shame and the guilt, so that you can then tackle the other issues, all the other remnants of, how did I become that person? Why did I join in the first place? Why didn't I leave sooner? All of those things have to be intimately taken apart. And I think, the best way to do it, obviously, in my opinion, is to get my book and my other book, Escaping Utopia, for people born in, to find, which is very difficult, find a therapist who understands about post-cult after effects. And I'm happy to say that my 2 colleagues and I that I've been working with are going to start doing courses for therapists, CEU.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So that
Brilliant.
We can have more therapists who are knowledgeable about this stuff. Finding a support group. And you have to be careful, because there's a lot of non-moderated support groups, and then people can get very triggered and people fall back into their cult mindsets and start bullying each other. And, so you have to be careful about that. And of course, again, my colleagues and I are now offering courses, recovery courses on Zoom, with different topics, depending on what the person wants to deal with, at quite a reasonable price, I think. And so anyone interested in that could email us at takebackyourliferecovery@gmail.com and get on our mailing list. But it takes time. It takes, because you can't do it all at once. It's really going to be, recovery is really an emotional roller coaster. And so there are times when you just need to step back and say, I'm not going to deal with this right now. It's too much. I need to just, take care of my kids or whatever. And then something will happen and it comes back, and you'll, get back into looking at books and reading and talking with other former members, if that's possible. So I think anything that you can do that will validate your experience and help you undo the trauma. So one thing that's very helpful is what's called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, which is about teaching people skills for what happens when they go into a panic attack or an anxiety attack, and you learn these different things to do that calm you down. And that's one part of all of our courses, is we teach a couple of skills at the end of each class. So, there are resources. There are very few resources, but hopefully people can find ways to, get it out of their brain as much as they can and have a happy life.
Indeed. I'm really glad that you're making those resources, available, because that's obviously something I run up against.
Yes.
People will say, well, I'm trying to find a therapist, but, I've had therapists and they don't seem to think cults are even a thing. And
right.
So, to have that resource available for therapists is, I think, incredibly valuable.
Right.
If I'm thinking about issues or roadblocks with cult recovery, or things that people might run up against, one is that people could fall into a sense of denialism. They could say, yes, I've been in a cult. Yes, it was terrible. But I'm just going to block it out of my mind completely and trust that everything's going to be okay.
That doesn't work.
And sorry, I'll let you answer that one first.
Well, I was going to say, I've had people contact me. Yes, actually, someone just contacted me who was in my group, in the group I was in. It wasn't my group. So it's 35 years later, and he found me on the internet. He said he's sort of been following what I do. He's never talked about it, never dealt with it. And so, we had a long phone conversation, and memories, stuff is just pouring out of him, and So you can't just shut it away, unless it was a very minimal experience. But any experience of any length, there are going to be remnants in your mind and in your body, and if you don't take care of those, they're going to come out in some other way. I mean, I have someone who also has just contacted me, who was born in a cult, left, and then got involved again with that leader. He's married now and has children, and he's realized, I mean, good on him, he's realized that he's behaving the same way he did in the cult to his wife and children. And so he wants to do some individual sessions with me to kind of unpack that. And so it's going to hang there, and people need to deny denialism.
Absolutely. So on the other extreme, you have on the one hand people perhaps being in denial about the need for recovery, and on the other end of the extreme you could have people who are so full of contempt for their experience and what their experience has done to them that they just want to take like a flamethrower to everything in their psyche that is in any way cult connected, so that they can effectively purge anything about the cult from themselves, to the point where it's kind of a scorched earth approach, and the cult never happened. Is that a realistic thing to aim for?
And I think that, that's another, as I was saying earlier, it comes in fits and starts, and you have to, you really have to do a focused recovery, and you have to be kind of determined about it, and not erratic, and not overly crazed about it. And because otherwise you're sinking into a kind of cult of one, where you're just.
Do you think it's important to be realistic and
yes,
as to what can be achieved?
And I think be a bit methodical about how you go about it. And another thing that's an excellent resource these days is that there are some really excellent workbooks available for people. And one of our projects is to actually write a workbook to go along with Take Back Your Life. But there's a complex PTSD workbook. There's another workbook called Surviving from Trauma or something like that. They're all available on Amazon. So, using a workbook like that can also keep you focused, so that you're not just, running around with an AR-15, so to speak.
I've kind of come to the realization that, I am who I am, kind of in a way, because of my cult experience. I literally would be a different person if I'd never had any involvement in the cult. So trying to purge absolutely everything about the cult from my psyche and my life it's just not going to happen. Right. But what I can aim for is for those experiences to not control me and my behaviors now, So.
Exactly. That's really important. I think the other phenomenon that can be disconcerting is when former members become activists too soon. And I know I've had experience with, a number of groups of people from one particular cult who want to start a nonprofit, or, they're active online, and then they're not recovered enough. They're not, settled enough in their own mind, so that again, they start acting out. They trigger each other. They start acting like they were in the cult, and those things usually go belly up. So I'm all for advocacy and activism and educating the public about cults, but I think many people run into that too soon when they're not ready. And I think the other phenomena is wanting to go back and get everybody out, especially your friends and family or whatever, which I call the martyr complex. It's sort of like, you have to deal with yourself first. You have to focus on your own recovery and yourself first, and not try to be getting everybody out right away, because that's just not going to work.
Yeah. And you've again segued beautifully into our next question. Is it possible to, are you reading my notes, Dr. Lalich?
No, I'm not.
Is it possible to extract someone from a cult?
Well, I don't think you extract someone. I think the idea is, if you can, to plant seeds that will help them wake up, so that they will make their own decision about it. And that's why in the old days, when they did, kidnap deprogrammings, which of course were first of all illegal, often didn't work because they were forceful. And whenever you challenge or confront someone who's in a cult, it's only going to push them further in. So I think the important thing is to always maintain contact, like whatever you can do, never cut the person off. They may cut you off, but don't cut them off. To try to stay in their mind as much as you can, whether that's depending on what that person's allowed to do in the group they're in. I know in the witnesses, there's that the shunning, which makes it impossible for people. But if you can stay in touch through phone calling or letters or postcards when you travel, whatever, I think the important thing to do as someone on the outside is to try to make emotional appeals, right? So do things that will remind the person of times that were better, of the times you both went fishing and had such a great time, or send a postcard when you travel and say, wish you were here, things like that, that'll tug at the heartstrings, because it's the emotions that are shut down and manipulated in the cult. And it's my belief that everybody in a cult has doubts. I mean, I was a true believer, believe me, and I had doubts. And of course, you can't express those doubts. So you put them on this shelf, this is how I see it. You put them on this shelf in the back of your head. So as someone on the outside, if you can plant little seeds on that shelf, that'll grow and make the shelf heavier and heavier. And one day that person will either see something or hear something or be witness to something and say, and the shelf will break. And they'll say, they may not say, oh, I'm in a cult, but they'll say, something's not right here. I'm not sure this is in my best interest. I'm not sure this kind of behavior is right, right? And then they can start to think about leaving. And then that may take planning. It's not easy sometimes to just walk right out the door. So it's definitely a process. And again, for those on the outside, I believe it's important to present yourself as a safe haven, right? That if that person decides to ever change their mind, that they can come to you, they can sleep, they can talk if they want to talk. There's no pressure. You're not going to say, see, I told you so. You should never join that, right? And that there's just a safe haven, a place where they can decompress and they're not going to be badgered. And knowing that there is some place like that they can go to will hopefully speed up the process.
It's safe to say, isn't it, that a lot of this very greatly depends on circumstances, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So, for example, you could have, let's say, a wife who's woken up from Jehovah's Witnesses and her husband is still a Jehovah's Witness. And, there's going to be constant contact, even if it's going to be a very stressed situation. Whereas on the other hand, a child who's being disfellowshipped from Jehovah's Witness parents and they're shunning that child, and the child literally never gets to see them for perhaps years or even decades. Again, in that situation, there's no opportunity, is there, to develop any kind of rapport?
No. I mean, there's many cases where, I'm working with several families now. They don't even know where their son or daughter is, I had a case where, the daughter went off to her junior year in Copenhagen and the pandemic happened. She was stuck there and she got recruited into a cult, and the parents are moving heaven and earth to try to get her to come home. And, so sometimes it's impossible to have any communication at all. And then I guess you just have to hope the person will open up one day. And I think the shunning, certainly is probably the primary hallmark of what's wrong with the Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, there's a lot of things wrong with the Jehovah's Witnesses, but I think the shunning that people experience is so devastating. And, I want to mention also, I did an article a number of years ago about gay ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and what it was like for them, either being kicked out or leaving on their own or having to marry someone and have a family and knowing that's not who they were. And the article got published in an academic journal, but it's on my website if people want to see it. And it's called Inside and Outcast. So, because I think that's a whole other aspect of the witnesses that's really harmful.
Absolutely. And, it was brought into sharp context only last year. There was an online convention called Always Rejoice, and one of the governing body members, Stephen Lett, made some very distasteful remarks about the fact that, someone could be resurrected into the paradise. A gay person, could be resurrected into the paradise still gay, and they would have to get rid of their gayness within a certain period, or they would be, I don't know, executed. And prior to that, you had, generations of Jehovah's Witnesses growing up as LGBTQ plus, feeling as though that there was something wrong with them. There was some abomination with them.
Right.
But at least if they were to die and get resurrected, they would be given a perfect body and it wouldn't be a problem. Or in the paradise, it would somehow fix itself. So what Stephen Lett did was he basically told that all of these children, you're going to have this problem even in the paradise.
Oh, that's awful. And is he part of the governing body? Or?
He's part of the governing body. And I interviewed his niece, who told me that when he gave that talk, it was in the aftermath of his nephew, who was gay, committing suicide.
Oh, Jesus.
So, yeah, it's a really huge problem, unfortunately.
I mean, and just the lack of compassion and the cruelty of comments like that. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. And one just, again, returning to this question of, is it possible to extract someone? I think I speak for a lot. There's a contingent, I should say, of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who feel, given the gravity of the situation, given how detrimental it is for someone to be in a cult, basically the ends can sometimes justify the means. And so what we see sometimes is very extreme action being taken where witnesses are perhaps confronted on the street when they're standing next to their literature carts.
No.
Or perhaps there's some other kind of confrontation behind closed doors in a family setting or in a kingdom hall. Do you feel as though that sort of tactic is advisable?
No. I'm of the mind that whenever you have an ends justifies the means philosophy, you're in trouble, because that's what cults are all about. The ends justify the means, and the kind of behaviors and things they do, and the things that are imposed on the members. And so any kind of extreme or confrontational technique, I would not abide by. I don't think it's helpful. As I said earlier, I think it's just going to drive that person more into the group, and it in a sense justifies, or reinforces the things they've been told about people on the outside. So it's not a good way to go. No.
Yeah. It's such a delicate situation, isn't it? I think about it in terms of, if you're going to operate on someone, do you do it with a meat cleaver or with a scalpel? And I think if you're going to be too confrontational, you're venturing into meat cleaver territory rather than scalpel territory. And
as someone who just had a hip replacement, that's a terrible image.
I do apologize.
That's okay.
I'm bracing myself for legal action now, but no. But yeah, it is such a sensitive. I think there's an art to it almost, and especially when you're in a family setting,
yes.
Definitely important to tread carefully.
Yeah, and I know people want their family member or whoever it is, their best friend, to leave, but I think patience is a virtue, as they say, and a lot of people do eventually leave. I mean, I've worked with people who left after 40 years, their entire life, from age 20 on was being involved in something, and they finally leave. Something happens. They see something on TV or they hear something, and it's like, oh my God. So we just need to be patient and do whatever we can in a thoughtful, compassionate way.
Absolutely. I echo those words. And there's one final question, which I've thought of while this video has been in filming. Okay. What's the solution? Because when you were speaking previously, you were talking about, what a mountain there is in terms of kind of raising broader awareness. You spoke earlier about educating mental health professionals about the nuances of cults. In terms of society, what society can do, what governments can do, what the way forward is, so that future generations don't have to deal with this in the way that we're dealing with it. What do you feel, the long-term solution is?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be a millionaire. But I think each of us doing what we can do, like you have been and like I have been, and the many other people who are out there educating about cults. I think what's promising today is sort of the number of podcasts about cults, the number of quite good documentaries that have come out. I mean, the media seems to have sort of gotten away from the sensationalism and are doing more in-depth kind of coverage. Obviously, education, which, I mean, I know in this country, the educational system is just a mess, and kids aren't taught critical thinking. When I was a professor, I was horrified at the level of writing, thinking, analytical abilities of my students. And so having some kind of educational program on a national scale, which of course is socialism or something. So you can't say that, but, and I think as for the government, we certainly don't want to get too intrusive, but I think what the government can do is really go after the really extreme groups on the right or the left. I mean, most of them are primarily on the right. The left's never been very good at organizing. So, but I think holding those groups accountable, arresting people, busting up those groups, because, what's happened here in America is these far right groups were really given license by the former guy, as we call him, because nobody ever wants to say his name. And so it's really created a culture of violence and us versus them thinking in countrywide. And so there's such polarization. And then these extreme right groups, the hate groups, the white supremacists, et cetera, here they had a high public official in their camp. So it gave them a kind of publicity that they've never had before. They were always just fringe groups and everybody was like, who cares about them? But now they're kind of groovy and popular, right? And then we've got the whole internet problem. So the government, in whatever way it can, legitimately, without overreaching, needs to shut some of this stuff down. And then we just have to hope for the best. It's difficult. I've never been, I'm 76 years old, and I never thought I would see this in America. This approach to fascism, really, I don't mean to sound, hysterical, but it's frightening what's happening here in this country.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I'm 42, and for most of my life, I've been forcibly apolitical. So I've been not allowed to have an opinion on politics. But you can never be completely apolitical, can you? And whenever you're watching, when I think back on 4 decades of kind of watching the news and knowing something about what's going on in the world, I can never remember the world being as polarized and divided as it is it is now. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's really frightening.
Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just saying, we just have to keep doing what we're doing, each one of us, in whatever way we can to bring some rational thinking back to people.
You mentioned as well, a limit as to how much the government can do. In Russia, Putin's regime has banned Jehovah's Witnesses, and you can imagine what effect this has had on the organization's propaganda, because they've had no shortage of scenarios that they can reenact and show that Satan's world is oppressing God's one true people. Would it be fair to say that, when governments step in, they do need to step in, but they need to do so for a reason? And the reason can't simply be, we don't like this particular group. The reason has to be, this particular area of abuse is wrong and we need to stop it happening.
Yes, I think government or law enforcement needs to be very careful. And certainly there are plenty of groups that are committing criminal activities. And so that should be the focus rather than we don't like them or, they're spreading rumors, whatever. It has to be and there, there's a lot of that going on. And it's I know here in this country, it's practically impossible to get law enforcement interested. They're kind of like, well, these are adults, it's their choice. So I think the focus now of trying to get this whole concept of coercion in the courts, understand for the courts and juries and people to understand what is coercion. And it's the same thing we went through with domestic abuse, oh, why doesn't she leave? Duh. So if we can get that concept into the courts and into the public's mind about, no, these aren't adults who are making their choices. They're being, overly influenced and coerced.
Is that your preferred word? Because it's been a little bit of a subject of controversy as to what we call it. Do we call it mind control? Do we call it undue influence? I'm assuming coercion is your preferred term.
I think, first of all, undue influence is, in America anyway, it's a legal term that has a very particular definition, and it's very difficult to use it in a lot of cases. Although obviously the concept is right on. Mind control is a made-up term. There is no such thing as mind control. So I never use that term. I believe that the kind of indoctrination that's done, which we might associate with brainwashing as described by Robert Lifton, is really a kind of a re-socialization process where the person's being changed and taking on a new worldview, which is what I was talking about before. So I think coercion really does, I think, touch on enough of the aspects of what happens, and that the coercion is not recognizable because of the social psychology of it all and how the cults are doing things that we're used to, right? They're preying on guilt and shame and fear, only it's a very concerted effort, and you're not recognizing it. And that's why the peer pressure is so important, because it's really part of what I think makes it all work, which I don't think we talk about enough when we talk about cults. The leader almost always has nothing to do with it, right? It's the range of leaders and then the peer pressure of you and your comrades, right? And not wanting to let them down or not wanting to be shamed in front of them or whatever it might be. So
I definitely think it's important to, be able to talk about it in the right language. I'm just, if you don't mind me taking you back to, what you just said about mind control, isn't coercion a way of basically just controlling someone's mind, in other words, altering their behavior, which ultimately stems from the mind?
Yes. But if we want to try to be scientific about it, I think using a term like mind control, which came out of nowhere, is not scientifically based, as a term. And that, to me, it sounds so mechanical. And it's not a mechanical process. It's a very fluid process, and it's an ongoing process. So it's not just like one day, the cult leader looks at you and snap, you're brainwashed and you're going to do whatever they say and be a deployable agent.
Flicks a switch on a remote control.
Exactly. It's not quite like that. So I think that my objection to mind control is that it sort of doesn't really convey the depth of the process and the longevity of the process. And, that's why sometimes when people get a chance to leave or go home or whatever, they start to think a little differently because they're in a new environment, right? So if they were really mind controlled, well, that wouldn't work, right? It's not the Manchurian Candidate, which is a very mechanical way of looking at it. So that's my stance on that.
Interesting. I really appreciate you sharing that, because it's something that I've spoken about before with various different colleagues that you're familiar with working with, and I think getting the language right is a very important way of, because we need to identify the problem in order to tackle it, don't we? So
yes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for helping us, steering us through this complicated subject of cult recovery by superbly answering those questions. And hopefully this video will be a long-standing resource for people who are looking into this, but there will be further links below for anyone who wants to check out your work in more detail, or indeed order any of your fine books. So I really do recommend that you do that, viewers. Thank you so much, Dr. Lalich.
Okay, thank you so much, Lloyd, for having me on the show.
So viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I certainly have. Don't forget that you can watch similar videos by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching.